Hideaki Anno once said the Christian imagery in Evangelion didn't really mean anything. He just thought it looked cool. And certain viewers took that and went, "See, it's not that deep, you're all overthinking a cartoon." But is that really all there is to this kind of discourse? This specific argument, whether something is deep or whether everyone's just reading too much into it, happens a lot with all kinds of shows and stories, and everyone seems convinced that they have it right. Which raises an interesting question. What would it even mean to read a show properly? Because media literacy gets thrown around like an insult a lot now, and I'm not sure most of us, me included, could define it if pushed. But you know what? I'm gonna damn well try. So, right, media literacy. Before looking at some common examples of analysis pitfalls in the kind of media we're interested in, anime and manga, let's get the boring bit out of the way. The official definition, because apparently there is one of those. The National Association for Media Literacy Education defines it as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. Which sounds lovely until you notice that studies about it mostly focus on news, ads, and propaganda. Can you spot a biased source? Can you tell a real article from a sponsored one? If I'm being honest, some of the most useful skills someone can have right now. But it's not what most of us in an anime comment section are on about. Nobody's calling you media illiterate for getting fooled by an ad, though we probably are. The common topics run more along the lines of missing the point, conflating depiction with endorsement, overemphasizing trivial elements, style over substance, mismatching expectations, death of the author versus authorial intent, and we'll look into those in a moment. For now, I'm going to use this little joke as an example of literacy in storytelling. I won't insult you by explaining the joke, but the whole point lies basically in what is never said out loud. A strained father-son relationship you infer from one misplaced word, not from anything directly expressed. Nobody said, "My dad and I aren't close." You fill that in. And that's the media literacy people are really arguing about. The thing is, pulling meaning out of what isn't spelled out is less a media skill and more plain old reading. More specifically, functional literacy. Not just decoding the words, but actually doing something with them. Following an argument, making inferences, holding a long scene together in your head. And we do measure this all around the world. The recent numbers are, let's say, not a cause for celebration. The latest adult round found literacy falling across most of the developed world compared to 10 years ago, with only a couple of countries actually improving. This kind of data comes with asterisks, of course. I won't go into them right now, but the general direction is downward. Okay, but why? The regular suspect is our shrinking attention span, though before you blame your phone, the science is messier than the headlines, isn't it always? But the fact that actual sustained deep focus has become harder to summon, though, that part looks real enough. Certainly feels real to me, at least, if I'm being honest. There's this reading researcher, Marianne Wolf, who separates skimming from what she calls deep reading. The mind space where you infer, lean on background knowledge, connect things by analogy, even feel your way into a character. And that list is more or less the exact toolkit you need to understand any piece of fiction, whether it's in written or visual format. Reading a novel well and reading an anime well pull on the same muscles, metaphorically speaking. So what happens when those muscles go slack? There's a small study that I found that's a pretty good snapshot of what's happening. Researchers gave a group of English majors the first few paragraphs of Charles Dickens's Bleak House and asked them to put it in plain English. They were even allowed access to their phones to look up unknown words or concepts. More than half couldn't really manage it. What I found interesting wasn't the failure per se, but rather what caused it. The struggling readers would hit something dense, describe the vague gist, skip whatever felt unimportant, and move on, never quite noticing that their version stopped making sense at some point. And I'm going to show you what happened here with concrete and sometimes amusing examples, and then go over some similar examples in anime. This is a paragraph that a few had difficulty with. Begin quote. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a Megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. And now, here's one subject's reading, begin quote. So, it's probably some kind of animal. Yup, I think we encountered some kind of animal these characters have met in the street. End quote. And another subject, begin quote. So, it's like, the mud was all in the streets and so everything's being like kind of washed around and we might find Megalosaurus bones, but he says they're waddling all up the hill. End quote. So there's a dinosaur loose in London now, or its bones? Except, read it again, Dickens didn't put one there. The entire thing is expressed as a hypothetical, as signaled by that as if part. The mud is just so primeval, it's as though the world only recently came out after the flood. And you didn't need to know what a Megalosaurus is, by the way. 40 feet long, elephantine lizard, the saurus on the end. The context gives you very large prehistoric reptile for free. And I do expect an English major to know enough to not think Dickens is likely to be writing Jurassic Park. The boundary created by reasonable expectations from the type of work we are interacting with can actually help comprehension. If I'm watching a regular slice of life show and suddenly an alien abduction scene appears, I'm probably going to think it's some sort of dream sequence, not that the show has suddenly become intergalaxy body snatchers. Here's another difficult paragraph. Begin quote. The Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting here, as here he is, with a foggy glory around his head, addressed by a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief. And this is the response. Quote, describing him in a room with an animal, I think, great whiskers, a cat? End quote. This is my favorite because somebody has put a cat in the High Court. Previous paragraphs already mentioned the High Court of Chancery, so the setting should be established. Great whiskers does sound like something you'd say about a cat, but that's the only thing the subject zeroed in on. But the whiskers belong to a large advocate, a lawyer, who also has a little voice and an interminable brief. So the cat presumably is also reading from a legal document? Since the tone of the work so far is rather somber, there's nothing to indicate that Dickens would be going for this kind of humorous, whimsical description. The cat is really just the bill for an earlier mistake. If you missed the courtroom reference 2 paragraphs ago, there's no lawyer here for the whiskers to belong to, so they'll wander off and find the nearest creature. I think it illustrates what happens when skipping over parts of a work of fiction becomes normalized. Admit it, how many of you started directly with JoJo's Part 3? No judgment, I've been guilty of things like that myself, unfortunately. And finally, the most important misreading. Almost half of the test subjects failed to notice that the extract was focusing on a court of law, judges, and lawyers, despite High Court of Chancery being mentioned quite early on. Here's a relevant paragraph. Begin quote. The various solicitors in the cause, some 2 or 3 of whom have inherited it from their fathers, who made a fortune by it, ought to be, ranged in a line, in a long matted well, but you might look in vain for truth at the bottom of it, between the registrar's red table and the silk gowns with bills, cross-bills, answers, rejoinders, injunctions, affidavits, issues, mountains of costly nonsense piled before them. End quote. This is a bit like missing a beach while standing in the sea. Yes, solicitor is the British word for a certain type of lawyer, and maybe you don't know it. Side note, it's not just British, but I'm not getting into that right now. But look at the whole paragraph. Presumably, we can infer we're talking about a profession, a lucrative one at that has a strained relationship with the truth, that can be performed in an institution where people wear specific formal clothing, and it involves a lot of legal paperwork. So, lawyers, right? I also like to point out this part. In a long matted well, but you might look in vain for truth at the bottom of it. It's a play on words. The first well here is referring to the well of the court, and the part between parentheses is a reference to the saying, truth lies at the bottom of a well. Not knowing the specific references is, I think, understandable, but realizing that we are not talking about a literal water well and catching the cynicism should be entirely possible for a good, attentive reader. What I'm getting at is this. It's the same way we can understand fictional works from different cultures, let's say Japanese anime and manga for example, even when we're not entirely familiar with the references. Usually because the meaning sitting underneath the reference tends to relate to universal human experiences, which, if you ask me, is what fiction is all about. Let's take Gintama, which is a perfect guinea pig because it's chock full of Japanese in-jokes. For example, Shinpachi is the world's most devoted member of an idol's fan club. Now, you may or may not be familiar with Japanese idol culture, the manufactured pop stars, the pen lights, the slightly unsettling parasocial economy of it all. But you don't really need to, because obsessive superfan is a person you've seen before, and the character enacts that perfectly. Knowing the specific phenomenon it satirizes is just a bonus. Another example is in one season's beginning scene, where Gintoki holds a press conference and completely melts down, sobbing, screaming, pounding the table like a giant toddler. That's parodying a specific Japanese politician's very real, very public breakdown, which you've probably never heard of. You should look it up, by the way, it's funny stuff. But if you pay attention to the character, the way he speaks, his posture, his hair, the setting, the interpretation parody of a public figure holding a press conference isn't far behind. Especially in the context of a story that has done this in the past. Attention and immersion are key to fully enjoying any work of fiction. A small reminder that if you enjoy this kind of analytical content, I will be making more of these kinds of videos, so maybe consider subscribing if you're interested. It does help keep me motivated. Anyway, on with the show. Let's look at some other examples of controversial interpretations in anime. Like Light in Death Note, he has some supporters. The Corsi version of Light Yagami is a normal honors student motivated by a sense of justice who slowly and tragically falls, but who actually had the right idea. Except if you look at his thoughts and actions in the first episode, before all the madness goes down, what stands out is how much he centers himself in all of it. His thought while considering whether the Death Note might work before even getting the idea of using a criminal as a test subject is, would that make me a murderer? Notice how this is about his own image, not the life he might take. And the brief moment he thinks the note failed, he turns away from the news and seems to lose interest in the fate of the people who were held hostage. Later, sizing up a bully classmate as victim number 2, he worries about whether it'll trace back to him, but doesn't look twice at the kid that bully was hurting. Every thought circles back to the same place. The world he hates, his boredom, the judgment only he can deliver, how good it is that he got the notebook, ending naturally on godhood. Next up, the brilliant visual of the X marks and a silent voice. It is incredibly easy to look at those big blue crosses on everyone's faces and assume they represent how the world has isolated and rejected Shoya. But a closer inspection reveals that those X's aren't theirs, but his. They're him punishing himself, refusing to raise his eyes and look at another human being, or simply keeping his distance. Look at his interactions with Ueno, whose X peels away when Shoya starts to relax around her, and then reappears the moment her attitude makes him want to distance himself. Even at the end, at the school festival, when the X's finally peel off and fall to the floor, it doesn't happen so much because the crowd suddenly changes their mind about him, but more so because he decides to look up and stop punishing himself. Finally, I'm gonna go with a JJK reference. Gojo's Honored One moment, which I couldn't help but notice so many lovingly enshrine as the hardest aura moment in anime. Big blow up. And yeah, that's part of it, it's JJK after all. But the important character angle that doesn't get the same attention is about his dissociation with his more human side. The manic look on his face, his own words before, when he apologizes to Riko for not feeling anger about her death, just this wonderful connection with the world around him. And the scene afterwards, with him holding Riko's bloody corpse while the Star religious group applauds her death, and then turning to his best friend to ask, should they kill them all? He hands over the decision because he can't tell anymore. He says outright he feels nothing either way and lets Geto be the judge, because up where he is now, right and wrong has stopped mattering. It's as if this awakening has lifted him clean out of the frame where grief or guilt or should even reach him. He's so far above everyone that he has to borrow a conscience. And this ties in neatly with the character's later loneliness angle. It's a pretty common archetype in classical storytelling, achieving absolute godlike genius but at the direct expense of the human connection that binds one to the rest of the regular world. Now, I have a feeling that me mentioning a popular battle shonen probably got some of you preparing comments of, it's not that deep. So I think it's finally time I address that phrase. Part of what makes it such a perfect conversation ender is that it's almost impossible to argue with because it's pretty slippery. Just how do we define depth in storytelling? How deep is that deep? Where's the line? What are the units? It's a bit like an artist being told their painting isn't vibey enough. There's nothing solid there to push against. The most common support for the phrase I've seen is, well, the author never intended that. And I get why that would sound like a real standard. The problem I see is that there are quite a few assumptions baked into it. First, we usually have no idea what the author intended. They're often dead, usually silent, and even when they're alive and chatty, what I meant isn't something they talk about that often, and even when they do, they sometimes contradict themselves. Treating a guess about intent as a fact is just a guess in a nicer coat. Another thing is that intent isn't only the conscious kind. Here's a nice story for you. In 1963, a 16-year-old kid got so fed up fighting with his English teacher about whether authors really plant all this symbolism that he decided to mail a questionnaire to 150 famous novelists and simply ask them. Isaac Asimov, the famous sci-fi writer, had a pretty honest take on planting symbolism. Consciously? Heavens no. Unconsciously? How can one avoid it? His argument captures the point I'm trying to make here perfectly. The author didn't sit down and plan it, and it means nothing are not the same thing. A choice can come from somewhere without coming from a predetermined plan. Creativity relies heavily on instinct, on the subconscious. And lastly, I think it's important to remember that reconstructing the author's intent is not the only purpose of discussing a work of fiction. Sometimes the point is to build on it. Ursula K. Le Guin describes readers as making the world with you. The author hands over the materials, and the reader contributes with their own perspective. Say, if someone says the whole isekai boom with all those overworked office drones dying and waking up powerful and finally appreciated reflects a generation that is burnt out, checking out of a reality that exhausted them, it doesn't matter one bit whether any given author meant that, as long as the intent isn't directly attributed to them. It's a conversation that builds on what's really there. Now, this is the part where people get nervous because the problem is easy to see. If watchers and readers get to build, isn't that the door swinging wide open to anything goes? Isn't every unhinged take now equally valid? And no, because a fuzzy boundary is not the absence of one. I can still say, for example, no, Story X is not meant to be an allegory for Y historical event because the event occurred after the story was written. Just because approaching a work of fiction isn't the same as approaching a scientific experiment and different well-supported readings are possible, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything goes. So here's the simple test I'd actually put forward, and it has nothing to do with mind reading the author. Anchor the interpretation to two things, the story and the argument it makes about it. A so-called symbol existing on its own doesn't really mean much. An interpretation earns its place when it's both anchored and load-bearing. Remember when I mentioned Evangelion in the beginning? Anno said the Christian imagery didn't really mean anything, he just thought it looked cool. Therefore, supposedly, it's not that deep. But the problem with that approach is that it assumes that if the meaning isn't where the symbol hunters were digging, in this case in some coded Catholic theology, then there's no meaning anywhere. And that's just not how it works. But also, he chose it because it looked cool doesn't make the choice random. It makes it a kind of vehicle. The crosses, the apocalyptic imagery, they do match the tone of cosmic dread and sacrifice in what is a pretty existentialist story. But yeah, it's not the main purpose of the story, and it's certainly not the only way to tell that story. I would say the overreader mistakes the vehicle for the destination, while the dismisser calls the vehicle entirely meaningless. I do think the imagery matters, it's just not the point. Think about it. Aesthetics, cinematography, a detailed description in a book. All of it enhances the experience. It just rarely carries meaning alone. It carries it in service of something. Now, I got a bit carried away, so I forgot to mention the main reason I find the "it's not that deep" phrase so annoying. Remember those Bleak House readers in the study I mentioned, the ones who had trouble understanding the first page? The thing is, most of them were confident they could read the whole 900-page novel and understand it, no problem. Because, the thing is, we don't know what we don't know. From our internal perspective, there's nothing here and I didn't see it can't really be distinguished. The danger with the phrase isn't just that it ends the conversation, but it can also convince us that there was never a conversation worth having. Now, before I let myself off the hook, I don't think the dismissers are wrong about everything. Because if a Bleak House reader gave me a 4,000-word essay on the cosmic significance of the fog on the first page of a novel that is 900 pages long, I'd definitely be tempted to ease the highlighter out of their hand. There is such a thing as reading too much into it and missing the forest for the trees. And when I say there is too much reading into it, it's not just me that thinks so. In fact, much bigger names had this take and in much harsher words. I've mentioned this in my themes video as well, but for example, the Russian novelist Vladimir Nabokov, a man who built novels so intricate they footnote their own footnotes, could be quite scornful of symbol hunting. He called great ideas hogwash and said he had no moral message. Now, this isn't to say there's nothing there, but more so that the search for patterns and symbols can lead people to missing the actual art. Think back to Evangelion, with the angels, Adam and Eve, the spiral Longinus, and all that stuff. People were so busy cracking a theological cipher that wasn't there that they walked straight past the very human story that was. Because it's not enough to point at a thing and go, look, a symbol, a pattern. You have to say what it's in service of. Otherwise, it just becomes fun trivia and nothing more. Take people who compare everything to the Odyssey. I'm sure you heard at least once something about One Piece, for example, being the modern Odyssey. Whenever I see that reference, it makes me think of this meme. Because yes, just like with the pyramids, it's just a really good way to stack rocks, or words in this case. It's not that so many stories secretly descend from Homer. It's that a departure, a trial, and a return is your basic hero's journey, which is a very popular storytelling formula across multiple cultures and civilizations. In terms of media analysis, I would say the comparison's worth is mainly if it shows you something about the story that you couldn't see or feel without it. If the answer's nothing, they're just the same shape, then congratulations, you've found the pyramid. And that's what I think is easily forgotten when interacting with fictional media. The why. The active engagement with the story on its terms without preconceived ideas, with an open and inquisitive mind. Actually, getting into how much a rigid, dogmatic approach to fictional media hurts our appreciation of creative works is a whole other video for another time. For now, I'm just going to leave you with the unglamorous image of stacking rocks until you get a pyramid or a story. Until next time, thanks as always for watching.